Yeah, in your own time.
Good to see you. It's been a
Recording,
while.
so you're ready to go.
Yeah, no, it's very nice to see you. So thank you for joining us again. I will just give a
Certainly.
brief introduction, and then we'll be off.
Ready to go.
Thank you. Well, welcome back to GBN America, where I'm, as always, delighted to be talking to Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who's one of the real friends of this podcast. Colonel, thank you for joining me. Who isn't America about to declare war on at the moment? Denmark's in your sights? Canada? Anywhere else?
Apparently the Panama Canal. So, I mean, let's just go ahead and add that to the list. This is, I got to say, this is a real puzzle why President Trump or President-elect Trump on the eve of taking over wants to really reach out and talk about so many different things he wants to come antagonistic toward. At the same time, he's talking about really wanting to knuckle down and get out of the Russia-Ukraine war and get that thing solved and off the table, almost like so we can turn our sights elsewhere or something. But, these are not really military problems or military threats to the United States. So it's a real puzzle why he's putting using the language that, well, I won't rule out using military force in Greenland or in the Panama Canal issue, for example, or talking about, renaming the Gulf of Mexico, or possibly maybe we should bring Canada into the United States. I mean, these are not helpful to anybody in the West, I got to say.
No, and I mean, I quite like the idea of Canada and the US joining, because then the king would become king of the United States, and after an interval
Well, there's always that, yeah.
250 years, it's about time you had a king back. But it seems that Greenland is the most serious, because Greenland has these enormous resources, a tiny population, and China has command of a lot of these resources. So there is something serious underpinning the talks about Greenland, isn't there?
Well, it depends on your perspective and point of view. In my view, there's not, because, no one, quote, owns Greenland except for ostensibly Denmark, but the Greenlandic people. But there's no prohibition for anyone to come and try to do business if they can, operate within the rules there, whether that's China, the United States, Great Britain, Panama. I mean, literally anyone who wants to do business and follows the rules has an opportunity to do that. But of course, there are some limitations that the Greenlandic people are saying, hey, don't think you're going to come in here with, a knife and fork and start carving the place up, because we have some limitations on what's going on. So it could be that. But I don't see, as a military man, I don't see a military threat that would even bring into the conversation talk about possibly taking over Greenland.
It's essentially an economic opportunity, isn't it, to balance against China with some of the rarer metals and other commodities that Greenland may have, and which are in short supply in the rest of the world. And it's as a sort of counter to China's monopolistic position.
Well, but I mean, they don't have a monopolistic position. They have a position. There's nobody that's preventing us from doing anything business-wise, the same thing that China is. And President Trump had an interesting framing of this when he made a comment just a couple of days ago at Mar-a-Lago in one of the conversations, and that he said, you could be standing there on Greenland and you can use binoculars, or you can even just see ships for China and Russia moving by there, and that ain't going to happen. Well, we don't get to decide what countries use international shipping any more than they get to decide. That's mostly international waters outside, obviously, the 12-mile exclusion zone. So that's not anything that we're, quote, not going to allow, not that we have any power over that. And again, getting back to the economic situation, nobody is preventing the U.S. from competing alongside China for these same resources. It's not a military issue.
And to come to the shipping issue, surely it's overwhelmingly in America's interest to maintain the freedom of the high seas. That's been a policy interest of the British Empire before, and now of America as the world superpower. And to undermine that, I would have thought, would be a terrible mistake.
Oh, it would be catastrophic, because we're already, and have been for decades, unfortunately, having these so-called freedom of navigation operations in the Taiwan Straits, for example. We say no one's going to stop our shipping anywhere here, or anybody's shipping, which it's free and open. Well, then we can't make that argument there and then not make it up here as well. It simply won't work. I don't think it'll even work among our allies, much less our adversaries. Nobody is going to be able to shut down international shipping lanes.
And this obviously ties in with the Panama Canal, which was built by America, and America had special rights over, which it handed many of them to the Panamanian government. And Donald Trump's talking about taking this authority back. Again, is he just winding people up before the inauguration, or is there something serious underpinning this?
Yeah, you know, what his motivation is for bringing this to a fever pitch now is uncertain. And I've been looking around, I've been talking to people, and I haven't found anybody that can give me any kind of an authoritative answer. Also, in that same Mar-a-Lago speech, he emphasized, you know, this now that China is running the ports on either end of the canal. China, for crying out loud. Well, it's not China. It's a Hong Kong company that's been there since 1997. There's nothing new about this at all. They had a 25-year lease. It was renewed in 2021, and they're still there. There's never been any problem with shipping going through there. No one has attempted to interdict or block or even threaten to do so. Panama, the country of Panama, runs the canal. They run the locks, not China, not the United States, not Hong Kong, only that. They're just a business that's operating there, and they have had no problem with American goods coming in and out. So why all of a sudden is Trump raising this up as an issue now, as though there's something changed recently when there hasn't? And I got to say, it just remains a head scratcher.
And the Canadian debate's even more fascinating. I remember when I studied history, looking at the War of 1812, which was a marvelous settlement because both governments wanted to settle and both populations were very bellicose. And so either side found maps that showed, in the American case, that most of America belonged to the UK under the agreements, and in the British case that most of Canada belonged to the US, and we agreed a line, which Trump has quite rightly called an arbitrary line. It is, but it's one that's maintained the peace for 213 years. Seems an odd thing to try and have a pop at now.
Well, it certainly doesn't. And by the way, if you go back and you look at that history, it wasn't very good militarily when the U.S. tried to do something into Canada. We got our butts handed to us, and you put it politely.
Well, we ate the president's dinner, I seem to remember, and is why the White House is white. But I wasn't going to dwell on that.
Well, yeah, that's not a popular conversation topic, especially these days. But in all seriousness, obviously there is no issue, should be no issue whatsoever between the United States and Canada, one of our most stalwart allies, economically, militarily, diplomatically, friendly. It's maybe even more of a puzzle why he's talking about Canada in this way, other than the fact that he wants to put a lot of tariffs on them because he says he wants to stop some fentanyl coming across the borders and some other issues. But if that's his motivation, this is a really bad way to do it.
Well, you see, I'm a fan of Donald Trump, let me admit that. Not always a popular view in the UK, but some of what he's saying I find really exciting. I think the economic opportunity, I think his seriousness about getting other countries to spend more on NATO is fundamentally important. His desire to reshape the state as a smaller, less intrusive state, I think is all really exciting. But I cannot understand these bits of it. Is it just to annoy the left, to annoy the Trudeaus of this world, who Donald Trump has never liked or taken very seriously? Or is there a maverick element of Trump that means that one has to accept it for the positives that I like, or is the maverick bit genuinely risky?
I think if we're being honest, that there is some risk in being a maverick. I think as there always is by definition. Anyone who's a maverick has the possibility of breaking something you don't want him to break for the possible things that he's doing good. And of course, I'm kind of like you. I'm a huge fan of what he's trying to do in the Russia-Ukraine war to end that war instead of keeping the bleeding going on for the Ukraine people, which will, in my view, ultimately lead to the defeat of Ukraine if we kept on our current course. But these things, I'm just telling you, it's just not helpful. There are more effective ways to be a maverick than I think what he's doing right now. And my gut tells me that this is more hyperbole. That this is just stirring the pot ahead of the inauguration on January 20th. And once he gets in power and he starts governing, then he'll come closer, I won't say to traditional presidency, but more traditional Trump presidency, which is typically, even in the first term, there was a lot more talk and being brash about things like he's going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. That kind of went by the wayside after he got in, et cetera. And I think that we'll see a lot of that happen here. My guess is that he's just using these techniques as a way to pressure other people to move things in a direction he wants. But I don't see any possibility truly that he's going to use military force on either Greenland, Denmark, or Panama Canal.
And Greenland is interesting because you can see that he's just putting a bit of pressure on to try and improve America's position in Greenland in terms of exploiting natural resources, and that this is in the hope of getting more permits from the Greenland government. And it's a tiny number of people. What is it, 17,000 people, the population of Greenland, for this vast area?
I think it's 45 for
45,
this vast
sorry.
area. That's the number I saw, which is still very small.
And therefore, it's susceptible to a little bit of pressure, and it wants to have a friendly relationship with the US. And the US, of course, has a military base there anyway. And so I can see what he might want to achieve, but I just wonder whether there's the risk of putting their backs up and making them feel that actually the last thing they want to do is a deal with the United States.
Well, it is. That's absolutely a concern that needs to be addressed, that there's a cost to being a maverick in some of these cases. And if you push too far, you could make the Greenlandic people say, okay, you know what? Yeah, when it comes to competing, we're going to compete with China. We're going to let them have more of these contracts, and we're going to, decide that's how it's going to work out, et cetera. Then you may actually put us in a position of economic disadvantageous situation, because we made them so angry and, as you say, kind of got the dander up. So now they're going to do things that are not in our interest economically. And we'll have to wait and see if Trump has any actions on that. But I would certainly hope he wouldn't.
And the one thing that's perhaps of interest to the UK, where he hasn't said that much, is on the Chagos Islands and Diego Garcia, where the British government is making a catastrophic agreement with Mauritius, paying them money to take over some British territory that has an American base on it. I'd quite like him to say something about that. That would be rather more helpful than saying things about Greenland and Panama.
Yeah, anything that has any strategic value, we can. But I guess if there's not a lot of dollars involved with it, or there's nothing else at risk and no connection with China, so he doesn't seem to be paying as much attention.
There's quite a Chinese risk, because the Chinese are very influential in Mauritius, have been giving Mauritius a lot of money. And so that's the risk there.
Well, that may be next up on the radar. Let's keep and see. We're not to January 20th yet, so who knows?
We're not. And I think your point that once he becomes president and is inaugurated, he'll be too busy to say these sorts of things, and that this is just the preamble, the opening chorus before the main opera begins. But that when the main opera begins, the opening chorus slightly fades away, is I think, a hopeful way of looking at it.
Hey. That's the way I would like to see. We'll see if that is the case, but yeah, let's get to the main opera.
Excellent. Colonel, as always, great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.